Hi, I want to talk today about a very brief introduction to disability history from about the mid 19th century to the early 20th century. It's as you might imagine, a very huge and complicated topic. And I really don't want to spend a lot of time on Native Americans, who were here first, of course, and how each family group uh, treated people with disabilities, but it's an interesting topic in itself. Or I'm going to kind of gloss over the colonial era, which had a lot of features that were borrowed from the countries that colonized the United States. So in particular, the Elizabethan Poor Laws and attitudes towards people with disabilities that the colonists brought with them. But just to draw your attention to, these are Cheng and Eng. They were famous conjoined twins who were born in the early 19th century, 1811. So there are lots of reasons why we approach disability in the way we do in the U.S., but I think it's really good to kind of go back and take a little look at how we started. So beginning in colonial times, every small community had some provision for families who had what would be categorized as misfortune, and these were kind of based on the Elizabethan Poor Law. So if you studied social history at all in any other course that you've taken, you know that there was some provision made where either a cash payment or sometimes shelter was given to people who had kind of social issues. There were early houses that were built here in New York City where people who had misfortune, for example, their house burnt down or they had some other misfortune, could go and receive shelter. Some families who had disabled family members would have been given extra food or cash. Some people with disabilities would have been placed in a kind of family care at that point. So a little extra help for the family. But in general, state municipalities were preoccupied with the deserving and undeserving poor. And that was partially because here in the colonial U.S., the income strata were kind of flat. So even though we had people who were wealthy and people who were not, the truth is that even the wealthiest people didn't have that much more than the very poor. So municipalities were struggling to kind of provide basic services for their citizens. And so one of the things they wanted to make sure of was that they didn't have people from the outside coming in to receive services that they weren't entitled to because they weren't a citizen really of that municipality. Now, that may resonate with you if you've been following our debates today about immigration. These debates have been going on since the country's founding. So as these municipalities sort of struggled with trying to provide the basics, they didn't want folks who were going to be chronically poor coming into their communities. So warning off the idea that they were, going to throw people out of these communities was very common in colonial America. After the Civil War, many American cities enacted these kind of ugly laws prohibiting people with unsightly or disgusting disabilities to appear in public. And here's some of these laws were in effect until the 1970s. So Chicago, for example, had an ugly law that it didn't repeal until about 40 years ago, 1974. But in 19th century America, disability wasn't necessarily viewed with as much stigma as it was, particularly in rural farm families where really you wanted as many people as possible in your family. I've been doing some genealogy research in my own family which farmed in South Carolina for a number of years, and they had 10 kids per generation, because if you're running a farm, the more hands you have, the better. And you didn't really have to be very perfectly formed in order to herd sheep or pick beans or do some of the other things that were needed on the farm. And you certainly, if you had a cognitive impairment, you still could be very useful. The truth was that because of medical advancements, many people who would have had what we call now severe disabilities wouldn't have survived childhood because we don't have the kind of medical interventions then that we do now. So in farming communities, many people with physical and intellectual disabilities made many contributions to their families. They were kind of valued members of their community. But it began to change with the Industrial Revolution. As people poured from farms into the cities, people needed good fine motor skills to sew or to run machines, and they needed literacy, including numerical literacy, in order to keep records and in order to keep track of how many of the items that they'd made. And at that point, disability began to be a little bit less valued, and with that became the rise of these special schools where people were sent for communities out of their community, their local community, in order to gain skills. So educators began to develop specialized schools to educate children with disabilities. The idea was to send children away for a few years. They were going to gain skills, then they were going to come back in their community. But after a few years, these schools grew into large campuses, and children began to become permanent residents. The labor of those residents was then used to sustain the facilities. So it wasn't atypical for a facility like that to have a dairy, a place that made clothes, a place that a large garden, and so forth. So they became self-sustaining, and the labor of the residents, which was unpaid, so it was kind of involuntary servitude, was used to perpetuate the institutions. And that became very common here in the United States. Recurrent depressions had caused more and more people to seek relief. So the idea of chronic pauperism became a chronic pressing social issue, that kind of what do we do about the poor? And attitudes towards the poor in this country have always been really mixed. On one hand, there's the deserving poor who need our help because through no fault of their own they find themselves in this situation. But we're very suspicious of people that we think might be scamming the government in some way. And that's been a recurring theme throughout American history. Dorothy Dix, beginning at about the mid-19th century, started to investigate the conditions of individuals with psychiatric disabilities in particular, but also other disabilities, and she lobbied for the creation of homes where they could be cared for in healthier environments and receive education and treatment. You have to remember that the cities at that time were fetid. There was no sanitation, there was horse manure in the streets, people didn't have electricity, so they would cook using coal or other kinds of, or wood, so there was smoke in the air. And the idea that the air was unhealthy for people became very widespread. So the idea that you were going to send people to the country where they could get fresh food and wholesome air and so forth became very prevalent. So the idea that folks with psychiatric disabilities, sometimes who were they were chained up in hog pens or in the county jail and pits in the floor, kind of things that Dorothy Dix described. It was an improvement for them to be taken from those situations and placed in a residential setting in the country. Eventually, this created small asylums, which then, as I said, became larger and larger institutions. But around the same time, there was also this curiosity about differences between humans. Part of this was created by the slavery debate. Why are some people slaves and why are some people other? And by the way, did you notice the slaves had dark skin, black skin, and whites were the ones who were buying and selling the slaves and using their labor. And people were curious about these differences in the years prior to and around the Civil War. So they became the subject of much debate. Who was smarter? How did these people end up as slaves? And with the kind of social Darwinism which we're famous for, these debates were framed in kind of interesting ways. So one of the antecedents for the stigmatization of people with disabilities originated with Sir Francis Galton. He was somebody who was kind of the father of statistics. He was a cousin of Charles Darwin, so he was British. He began to write about societal norms and to apply statistics to human difference. So if you think about the kind of norms that we have in terms of even how high off the ground the chair heights are, or our clothes, right? We come in standard sizes. That kind of standardization was a result of some of Galton's work, writing in about the mid-century, 1850, 1860. Galton began to apply his methods not only to physical differences, but also to intelligence. There was a great deal of curiosity, as I said, about human difference, about deviance, and why people were chronically poor or were criminals, and intelligence. The principle of inheritance weren't known yet because Mendel was still working on his experiments and hadn't published. So scientists used the only thing they could see, which was kind of a look at gross physical features. So scientists spent a large time measuring heads and measuring skulls, and the prevailing idea was the bigger your head was, the smarter you were. So Galton practiced this thing called craniology, and he would weigh the brains of dead people to determine relative intelligence. One widely used practice was to obtain skulls and fill them with birch seed or lead shot to determine how large the brain was. So they were trying to figure out the weight of the brain. The idea was the larger the brain, the more smart the person was. Not surprisingly, because Galton always knew where the skulls came from. So, a big shock was that, of course, he always found that skulls that came from white people were larger than those that had come from people who were born in Africa or Asians. So here's an illustration, the good mother. I'm going to take my picture off here now. The good mother and the unmotherly, and you can see that these features where this person has a receding chin and less hair and large brain and a small brain. Galton and his contemporaries weren't using the kind of scientific methods we use today. They always knew in advance where the skulls that were measuring originated, so it's not surprising their conclusions were so racially biased, but they were. Galton was the person who coined the term eugenics, meaning good birth, in 1883. He began advocating for discouraging marriage between the less desirable elements of society, so eventually they'd be eliminated, and society as a whole would be more productive and efficient. Around the same time, around 1880s, a U.S. Sociologist named Richard Dugdale was studying the prison system in Ulster County in New York State. He visited 13 jails, and during his study, he noticed how many of the inmates were related to each other, either by blood or by marriage, and he was curious about that. So he did all this kind of family genetics, and he traced one of the families back to a man named Max, who was a frontiersman born in the 1700s, who married, and Margaret, the mother of criminals, who married one of Max's sons. So in this family, Dugdale found criminals, brothel keepers, prostitutes, relief recipients who were chronically poor, right, and two people who were feeble-minded. And I've put a link to Dugdale's study in your course site in case you're interested in reading it. He published the results of his study in 1877 using a fictitious name for the family. He called them the Jukes, and his study was called The Jukes, a study in crime, pauperism, disease, and heredity. Now, Dugdale was actually not a bad person. He really was arguing for better education and opportunity for these folks. But of course, there were people who looked on it as a way to kind of characterize the idea that people inherited criminality and chronic pauperism or poverty. Dugdale wanted his work to lay the groundwork for improvements, but instead it stimulated conversations about the connection between heredity and crime. It was used to strengthen justification for sterilization and stigmatization that came about really around the turn of the century. So Galton's writing about societal norms, Dugdale is doing his study, and then, of course, our monk Gregor Mendel starts to publish about heredity and genetic inheritance in 1900. So his work was widely published among the scientific and intelligentsia here. In the late 19th and early 20th century, a French student of a craniologist, one of those folks measuring brains, who was a guy named Paul Broca, in France became discouraged, and he was unable to make his studies of brain size conform to expected outcomes. His name was Alfred Binet. He was a psychologist, and he wrote, "I was persuaded I had attacked an intractable problem. The measures, the required traveling, tiring procedures of all sorts, and they ended with the discouraging conclusion there's often not a millimeter of difference between the brain measure, cephalic measures of intelligent and less intelligent students. The idea of measuring intelligence by measuring heads seemed ridiculous, and I didn't want to publish a single line of it." In 1904, our friend Binet was asked by his friend, who was an educator, to develop a method to determine what specific learning assistance students who had learning problems in school needed. So he developed a series of brief tests that would measure and kind of tease out different skills, what students were good at, what they needed help with. The first scale was published in 1905 and the second in 1908. It's still the basis for what we use today as the Stanford-Binet IQ test. Binet said, though, that he thought intelligence was much too complex to capture with a single number. He refused to describe the test score as intelligence. He worried the test would be misused by teachers who would say, "Oh, here's a great opportunity to rid ourselves of the student who troubles us. It's too easy to discover signs of backwardness in an individual when you're forewarned that they have a low score on these tests." So Mendel's work on genetics is published in 1900. We've got Binet working on the IQ test in 1904. And around that time, an American zoologist named Charles Davenport, who was an avid follower of Galton's, he was a scientist, he taught biology courses at Cold Spring Harbor on Long Island. And it was widely publicized here in the U.S. So Davenport established a center at Cold Spring Harbor to study inheritance and genetics, and it's still there today. But by 1910, it was called the Eugenics Record Office. It was established there, funded by major families, Rockefellers, Carnegie Corporation, Harriman. It kept extensive records on people with disabilities, racial information on those who were considered deviant. So if you were arrested for any reason, your records went to the Eugenics Record Office. And it was in existence until 1944. Genetic research continues there today on genetic, stem cell, and cancer research. So Binet's IQ test is picked up by a psychologist at Vineland, an institution in southern New Jersey, which is still there today. You can go and see what remains of it. And this psychologist was Henry Herbert Goddard. H.H. Goddard was one of those people who is involved in professional organizations, who published and spoke widely, was a very respected psychologist. He was an avid follower of Galton and his study of norms. He translated Binet's work from French, and he advocated using this IQ test to separate the fit from the unfit. He distributed about 22,000 IQ tests, and he wrote and spoke extensively on this issue. He even sent people to Ellis Island to give the IQ test to people coming off the boats here to see if we could tease out the people who shouldn't be admitted into the country because of their low IQ and low skills. Goddard was particularly concerned that high-functioning people with intellectual disabilities might intermarry with normal people and thus degrade society by having offspring who were criminals or chronic paupers. So he was the person who coined the term moron to describe these dangerous people who were had intellectual disabilities or had that gene that made them, not quite normal, but they were going to intermarry somehow with so-called normal people. And this is what he wrote. "The idiot is not our greatest problem, but he is indeed loathsome. He lives his life and is done. He does not continue the race with a line of children like himself. It is the moron type that makes for our greatest problem." And what he was essentially saying is that people who have more severe disabilities would not be attractive to the opposite sex, or they're not likely to reproduce. But people who are so high functioning are much more likely to intermarry with the so-called typical population and have children that are then going to be also high functioning or chronic paupers or have disabilities. He also said if both parents are feeble-minded, all of the children will be feeble-minded. It's obvious that such matings should not be allowed. So they believed that feeble-mindedness was a single heritable gene, and if people were so designated, were prevented from having children, society would be much better off. And so convinced of he was this that he researched a family in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey and published a book about them called The Kallikak Family, a study in the heredity of feeble-minded. I've put a link to the book in your course materials as well, so you can see it in your course site if you're interested in his book. It looked like this. 1912 it was published. So like Dugdale's book about the Jukes, the Kallikaks were a fictitious name. It was a real family, though, and the patriarch was an upstanding citizen. He had married a woman of his social class, had children who also became, well-educated, upstanding citizens. But he had had a liaison with another woman, and his children with her were designated as either feeble-minded or undesirable. So she ended up in Vineland, as did her children. Her name was Deborah. Although his ideas were discredited later, Goddard's assertion that people designated as, quote, feeble-minded through the use of IQ tests should be segregated from society and prevented from having children. And he was out there widely advocating segregation and sterilization of people that he deemed to be morons so that they couldn't have children. He sent women who he trained to Ellis Island to make sure feeble-minded people weren't let into the country. They administered IQ tests to arriving immigrants, and later they could say, well, I can tell just by looking at somebody whether they're feeble-minded or not. But by then, states had already begun to sterilize people they considered undesirable, and that could be people who were arrested for stealing a loaf of bread, as well as people who clearly had an intellectual or other kind of disability. So in 1905, Pennsylvania passed the first bill allowing for sterilization, an act for the prevention of idiocy, it was called, and it allowed doctors to sterilize people if they thought procreation was inadvisable. And then other states followed. Indiana in 1907, and those were also poorhouse residents and prisoners, and without a distinction made about the gravity of the crime. California, Connecticut, and Washington State, New Jersey in 1911, New York in 1912. Records on all these criminals were kept in the Eugenics Records Office in Cold Spring Harbor. By the late 1930s, about 30,000 people had been sterilized here in the United States, but there were still questions about this practice among professionals and the public who were queasy about it. The issues of family planning, sterilization, eugenics, the poor, and people with disabilities was the subject of much conversation among leaders, including Margaret Sanger, the mother of family planning, who was not only an advocate of birth control, but also of eugenics. The idea was essentially that you would do better if you had fewer children. You could then concentrate the family resources on those fewer children. So it's pretty common that people who are advocates of family planning also were advocates of eugenics. And the whole idea here in this country was that we wanted to have a country of people who weren't so-called drained on society. So there were these better baby contests, and that where at state fairs you would bring, the fattest and prettiest baby would win the better baby contest. The idea was essentially that we wanted families to be healthier and happier. So that brings us to next week's class, Carrie Buck. And you'll find out who Carrie Buck is next week.